Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Disability Rights Center Presents. I'm your host, Cindy Robertson, and I'm a senior staff attorney with the Disability Rights Center. This is the second in a two-part series where we're discussing Lakeview Neurorehabilitation Center in Effingham, New Hampshire. There's been a number of publicity, newspaper articles, radio articles about things that have been happening in Lakeview, and we have decided to cover that story for you here today. My guests are Richard Cohen, the Executive Director at the Disability Rights Center, and Karen Rosenberg, who is also a Senior Staff Attorney at the Disability Rights Center. Karen and Dick were both involved in doing investigation, and we're going to go into more detail in this show about exactly what the investigation entailed, what the results were, and what the response has been. So I welcome you both back to the show. So I want to do a little bit of a recap for those of the audience who either forgot our first show or didn't see our first show. But very briefly, Lakeview is located in a very rural and remote part of New Hampshire. It initially was created to serve people with brain injuries, but currently it has evolved into covering a number of different people with disabilities, mostly developmental disabilities. And there's about 88 people that are at Lakeview currently. Karen, so we left our last show. We had started to talk about an initial investigation that you did in 2011 as a result of some complaints that the Disability Rights Center had received. So let's recap a bit from the 2011 investigation, what sort of prompted it, and you had indicated that there were certain recommendations that were made. So just do a brief recap of that for us.
Quickly, it was prompted by some injuries that a resident suffered as a result of a restraint. And we found that there was actually psychological abuse that a staff member at Lakeview engaged in with respect to this woman. We found that she wasn't treated appropriately. We found other abuse and neglect of other individuals during the course of our investigation. And we issued a report and a number of recommendations to Lakeview. And some of those recommendations included that they make sure that they appropriately staff people. So some residents require to be checked in on every 15 minutes. Some need someone to be with them all the time. Some people need constant eyes-on supervision, and Lakeview wasn't providing that. So we said they needed to take steps to make sure that people got the appropriate level of supervision. We recommended that they follow some of the policies that they had in place that they weren't following about developing and adhering to people's treatment plans. We recommended that they appropriately report abuse and neglect of individual residents at Lakeview, because we found that Lakeview didn't really have appropriate policies to ensure that when abuse or neglect happened, that Lakeview's staff was informing for example, the Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services, like Adult Protective Services or Children, Youth, and Families, that there was abuse. We recommended improvements in communication and just generally in terms of how they operated their programs to make sure that people got the level of care that they needed in that facility. And Lakeview made various representations to us in a follow-up meeting that we had with them that they would be changing their staffing patterns to ensure that people would get their required supervision, that they were going to be improving their communication by instituting an electronic medical record so that they'd be able to readily access information about people's medical needs or behavioral needs and challenges. They represented that they were going to be improving their training so that their staff would know when to report abuse and neglect and how to do that. Various improvements.
This was back in 2011.
So this was back in 2000. We met with them a couple times in 2011, and then also in the summer of 2012. Right. We had meetings with them.
So after you had the meetings and they made the representations, did things get better?
Well, I don't think so, because within a few months of the second meeting we had with them, we received information that someone had died up there, right. And the allegation was that he died as a result of their neglect or abuse.
Right. And when you the Disability Rights Center received the complaint,
right.
Issue, and did you investigate that death?
We did. We investigated that death.
And give our audience, let's just give our audience the details of what that involved.
So the person involved we're referring to as JD to protect the individual's confidentiality. But JD was a young man of about 22 years old, had a history of disabilities, some developmental disabilities, and also some medical issues, had a seizure disorder, and had been doing okay in his home community for a substantial amount of time. His seizure disorder was under control. His emotional issues were being attended to. He had a really nice life. But what happened was he had a nice living situation with someone who was sort of in charge of his life and, provided support to him on a day-to-day basis. That person, his service provider's circumstances changed, and he could no longer serve JD. And that really was difficult. It was like pulling the rug out from under him. It wasn't the service person's fault, but it was a circumstance that was very unsettling. And JD just really didn't do so well. And they tried sort of a temporary solution, another person, and it just wasn't working. He was very depressed. Ended up at New Hampshire Hospital. And because of his developmental disabilities, New Hampshire Hospital didn't feel that it was really an appropriate place for him to be. And so while the agencies involved in serving JD were scurrying around trying to find a place for him that would be appropriate in what he considered his home community, they decided to place him at Lakeview Neurorehabilitation Center for what was supposed to be a short-term, no more than 90-day time frame for them to develop a better place for him in his home community, and also try to do some evaluations to figure out why he, he really had a downslide during this difficult period, and see if there were things that could be put into place to prevent, to get him back on his feet and prevent that kind of downslide from happening again. But when he went there, he was very depressed. He missed what he considered his home. He was very active in his home community. He had his people. He had the restaurants he frequented. He had the gym club that he went to. He had all the things that made his life full. And putting him in this very segregated, isolated place where his people weren't there made things even worse. And he stopped eating, and he wasn't taking his medications regularly. Even though his seizure disorder had been really well controlled by medications when he was at home, he had some pretty intense seizures that resulted in him being hospitalized. And he got worse and worse. He was stumbling around. He was falling. He lost almost 50 pounds in less than a little over 2 months. He had lost maybe 2.5 months. He lost 50 pounds, which is a lot of weight to lose very quickly. Staff members at Lakeview, some of the direct care staff, were very concerned about him and asked medical staff to take a look at him. But it seemed that people didn't really. There wasn't a lot of follow through. In terms of the medical side. There also wasn't necessarily a lot of support. Some of the direct care support staff were very supportive and concerned about him, but other staff didn't abide by what was to be at his supervision level. The psychologist at Lakeview recognized that he was depressed, said staff needed to check on him every 15 minutes. We know that didn't happen. So finally, fast forward to his last day at Lakeview and his last day living on this earth, 72 days after he got there. In the middle of the night, a staff member noticed that he was lying on the floor naked in a pool of urine, and his own urine, and suspected that he had likely had a seizure, but didn't contact health services or do anything, just kind of put a sheet over him and left him there. And then when the morning staff came in, there was a conversation, and this overnight staff person let the morning staff people know that he was, he was in this condition. There were 2 people. There were supposed to be 3 people in the morning staff for a cabin of about 8 people. Only 2 were there. One actually left to take care of some other business, leaving one person to tend to about 8 other individuals who were, getting up and doing their morning routine. And so as a result, JD did not have every 15-minute watch. He continued to lie there. At one point, the remaining staff member determined that he was non-responsive but didn't do anything about it. It wasn't until around 9 in the morning or so, when the nurse came in to do her regular medication rounds, that she discovered that he was not breathing and started administering CPR, but it was really too late. And
that's
what
incredible.
happened.
That's an incredible story. I mean, it just seems like you don't even have to be trained to realize how terrible that story is on every level. On every level. So the Disability Rights Center got notification that there had been a death at Lakeview. Is that how that first came in?
Well, we can't really talk about who our sources were, but we were contacted, and the contact basically informed us that there were problems with the way JD was treated during his time there, that they suspected that this was a death that didn't have to happen, and that there was either through the action or inactions on the part of Lakeview that those actions or inactions led to his death.
So that was in 2012?
That was in 2012.
And you did an investigation into JD's death?
Right.
Yeah. And was there a report prepared as a result of that?
Yes. So we did an investigation. We actually retained an expert, a doctor, to review a lot of the medical records as well as just the procedures and policies that Lakeview had in place, so that we could get a real expert view on the situation. I mean, you said, anyone untrained would consider this problematic and really tragic, and but we wanted to make sure that we weren't missing anything and that it wasn't just our gut reaction, but that something really was going on here. And so, yes, our medical expert found there were all kinds of problems at that facility in terms of the way that he was treated, that there didn't seem to be a lot of concern about his rapidly declining medical condition, that there were issues with levels of supervision and failing to implement his level of supervision, that there was sort of a silo mentality at that facility where there was not good communication between the medical, neurological, and psychiatric providers, and not very good communication between those providers and staff. Another problem was that JD had a guardian and also had people from his home community who were involved in his life, yet they did not, Lakeview's personnel did really not give them full and timely information about his precipitous decline at that facility, because if they had been informed, they would have been in a position to try to make some changes.
Right.
So that's what our report essentially found.
And were there recommendations made as a result of that report, as there had been in 2011?
So, yeah, we did make recommendations, but I also want to say that during the course of this investigation, we became aware of a lot of other investigations involving abuse and neglect at Lakeview that had been conducted by the Department of Health and Human Services, the Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services, and also by the Bureau of Developmental Services, and by area agencies themselves. We also became aware of reports of investigations by the U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Safety Health, what is it?
OSHA.
Occupational Safety Health Administration had found unsafe workplace conditions there. So through all of this, we found we got a lot more information about even more issues there. The New York Justice Center had done a report there, and we started getting a hold of these reports. And so what we ended up doing was issuing the report about JD's death at the same time that we culled together these other reports and simultaneously issued two reports. The report of JD's death with recommendations that were particular to what we saw as the events and issues leading to his death, as well as a report summarizing all of these other incidences of abuse and neglect that had been founded by various entities, as well as OSHA's investigations and violations that they found. And we simultaneously issued a white paper summarizing those with recommendations that were broader than we issued in the white paper.
So, I didn't bring this up in our last show, but it isn't just New Hampshire residents that attend Lakeview or the Go. That's right?
Right.
They come from all over the country?
Yeah, more than half are from out of state.
Yeah, yeah. So when you just indicated that was New York had also been doing an investigation, so other states were looking into what was happening at Lakeview as well?
Well, we know that New York was looking into what was happening at Lakeview. Maine has since done a really tremendous job at looking into what's going on at Lakeview. They had been involved before when we did our first investigation, and when we published the investigation of JD's death and the white paper, Maine's protection and advocacy system really sprung into action, and they've done some monitoring, and their Department of Health and Human Services has also asked for corrective action, declared that they want to transition everybody out of that facility who's a Maine resident. So they've really stepped it up. I'm not sure that other states have taken quite as hard a line. I know that New York Justice Center did also issue a pretty scathing report about the deficiencies that they identified.
When you started looking into, when you were doing your investigation in JD's death, and then you realized there were all these other agencies that had been doing investigations on other claims of abuse and neglect, was there any sense of the time frame? Had they been doing their investigations before JD had passed away?
Yeah, I mean, some of the founded abuse and neglect occurred before JD's death. We actually, when we were in the midst of investigating JD's death and had started pulling together these other complaints that, I don't even know what it was, but we started getting calls about other instances and getting reports of founded abuse and neglect, including, like I said, reports that were founded by our Department of Health and Human Services. We had a meeting with the Department of Health and Human Services and the Licensing Bureau and Certification Bureau and the Bureau of Developmental Services to tell them that we had a lot of concerns about both the investigation that we were doing into the death, but also these other issues that had been brought to light to us that we thought that they were aware of. Some of the problems were even in the news. There was a young woman who was able to walk off the grounds and disappeared for a number of days in, it's mountain.
Which is a fairly common practice. There are people leaving because of lack of supervision.
Right. And when you had the meeting, did you get the sense that, did one hand know what the other hand was doing, or were they all sort of siloed and was Health and Human Services surprised to learn that someone else was doing an investigation, or what was the meeting? I mean, what was their response? Were they surprised, like, oh, we didn't know this, or?
Well, I don't know that it was that they didn't know it, but they didn't really have a system of making sure that founded abuse and neglect either by an area agency or the Bureau of Elderly Adult Services was necessarily going to the Licensing Bureau, which licenses Lakeview. And it also seemed that there wasn't a lot of will on the part of the Licensing Bureau to do very much with this information once it had it.
Right. Right.
I mean, one of the things the white paper showed along with the death was a couple things. One, that our suspicions and documentation that the staffing problems and all the problems that Karen mentioned and others were recurring and consistent, and promises had been made to correct them, and nothing happened. So it showed that these were recurrent, long-standing problems, and that just continued year after year. It also showed, secondly, that the Department of Health and Human Services and also the Department of Education, who licenses this place to operate, just was either unaware of the problems or was just looking the other way. Based on any one of these investigations, and particularly when you look at all of them, this place shouldn't be licensed. It should not be licensed to operate average folks, let alone folks with very challenging behaviors. Yet, despite what all these agencies were finding, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education allowed the program to continue year after year. Right. And that's been a real problem, because not only do you have a place that is not treating people and sometimes harming people, but you then depend on your state oversight agency to address it, and that was not happening either. So you have both a problem there and then a lack of oversight.
And really, it wasn't until we issued these two reports in tandem, and on the heels of that, our governor stepped up and basically said, this needs to stop.
Yeah.
And we can't have any new people from New Hampshire getting placed at this facility. There needs to be an outside look at what's going on there, and there also needs to be an outside look at the Department of Health and Human Services and how it's responded to the complaints and issues that have been raised over the years. Mm-hmm. And so that's what's happened, is that there was an outside evaluator who was retained to look at the Department of Health and Human Services. We're anticipating that her report will come out shortly. It's April 1st now. We're thinking it's going to come out in the next couple weeks. There was also a much more robust licensing review that the Department of Health and Human Services coordinated with some DHHS staff, plus another, I think he's a psychologist, is that right, Dick? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who works for the state but for a different agency. And they came out with a report which essentially validated all of our findings, found numerous violations of our state licensing law and rules, and just validated that there are serious deficiencies at this facility that are resulting in substandard care, which is endangering the health, safety, and well-being of the people who live there.
But they still didn't pull the license, and the problems that we were finding in 2011, 12, 13, and 14 continued even while they were there doing finally a more licensing review, a more robust report, but yet they continued to allow it to operate. And the other point about the licensing, particularly before this more robust licensing, even when they went there, even aside from all these reports that they could have just read, they'd go there and they wouldn't find all of the things that were obvious that everyone else was finding.
So they were actually on site.
Yeah, it would be like if you were in the middle of a forest and there's a fire burning, a forest fire burning all around you, and you don't see it. Right. And they never saw it after all those years. They're now seeing it because of the attention we brought to it, and then the governor's order asking for a more independent review. But it still remains to be seen whether or not they will allow this place to continue to operate.
But as we sit here today, it is still open, it is still operating, and there are still individuals at Lakeview.
There are. So what happened was that without securing the final report from this outside evaluator who I mentioned, they've worked with Lakeview to develop a corrective action plan. They've extended their license until the end of this calendar year, and people are still residing there. There's fewer than the 88 people who it's licensed to serve. I think there's probably half that number at Lakeview right now. I think, as I mentioned, even New Hampshire and other states have been trying to transition folks out of there, but they are being allowed to continue operating. And the other thing that makes that difficult to swallow is that even while they've been in the process of developing this corrective action plan and accepting a corrective action plan, there have been additional incidents and violations of New Hampshire's licensing laws which endanger people at Lakeview. So, for example, within the past couple months, there was an incident where actually it was observed by the DHHS monitors.
Health and Human Services.
Health and Human Services monitors. While they were there, kind of checking out the facility, they witnessed a Lakeview staff member restraining a resident in his bed. The staff member was bouncing up and down on top of him. And when the resident, I guess, was trying to grab at him, when the resident stopped trying to grab at him, the staff member let go of him and then just did haul off and punch him. And that was in the face.
After he'd calmed down.
After he'd calmed down, hauled up and punched him. And that was witnessed by Department of Health and Human Services monitors. And, the licensing department issued a finding that violated the patient's Bill of Rights. There have been numerous other incidences in which Lakeview residents have managed to leave the campus due to not having the staffing levels that they were supposed to have. One, at the very end of December, woman was taking a shower. She's supposed to have one-on-one. Her one-on-one went to do something else for a minute. During that short time period, she was able to walk out of the cabin naked, get under a 6-foot fence, and be gone for 45 minutes before they found her. So
in the middle of the winter.
In the middle, right. It was December 29th or 30th. So,
right.
And,
So
and we're not talking about Florida here. This is like north. It's cold.
Right. So even with the 2011 report, the 2012-13 investigation, all the other investigations by the other agencies, the white paper, the representations by Lakeview, the governor saying stop, it still continues internally there.
Yeah, if this were a regular hospital in the community, and with these kinds of problems, it wouldn't be allowed to operate for a minute. And even if this latest plan of correction, and we don't even have a plan of correction from really with regard to the Department of Education's findings, where they found that basically no education is going on. Even if the plan of correction ultimately could succeed, it's going to take months or maybe years. Meanwhile, they don't have the present capacity to serve these folks, and they shouldn't be licensed now. If they can ever develop that capacity and they want to reapply, that's fine. But there is absolutely no basis for this place to operate either an adult program or certainly an educational program.
Right. And are there new clients being sent to Lakeview, or have new admissions completely stopped?
Well, I know from it. We should talk about the Department of Education stuff because that's a little bit separate.
Go ahead.
But from the Department of Education standpoint, they are not allowing any new students to be placed there at all. And but I don't know whether, given that they have a corrective action plan in place, and whether the Department of Health and Human Services is now allowing any new admissions. I've not heard of any new admissions, but that's not clear to me.
Right.
Is that? Do you know anything different?
No, same with other states. I mean, the word has certainly gotten out to the other states, and like you said, New York and Maine have done their own investigation. Hopefully, they're not sending any new clients there.
But they do have a license now, and I don't believe that they're prohibited from taking any new clients. I'm just not sure that they are taking any new ones.
Yeah.
About the Department of Ed.
Right. We just have, go ahead very quickly.
Okay,
so
our investigations did not center in the Department of Education, but the Department of Education conducted its own investigation in response, and that's what came to them finding there's no education going on there and shutting the door.
I know, it's a lot of information, but I want to thank you both for joining us. Again, I want to tell our audience that if you have any issues that come to your attention, or if you have someone at Lakeview that you're concerned about, please feel free to call our office at the Disability Rights Center. We're still collecting information. Karen and Dick are still on top of this matter. And maybe in either future shows or check our website for updates as to how things progress, the corrective action, whether in fact it does get shut down at some point. But I do appreciate you both coming on. It's been very informative.
Oh, good. Thank you for having us. Right.
Thank you.